You open in a conference room in Hong Kong, November 2018. A man walks up to a podium at the world's most prestigious genome editing summit, not to receive an award, but to confess. He Jiankui, Stanford-trained, mild-mannered, 34 years old, tells the room he has already done the thing every scientist on the planet agreed was forbidden. He edited the DNA of living human embryos, implanted them, and let them grow into 2 baby girls. Lulu and Nana are already born. The edit is already in their cells, and it cannot be undone. The room doesn't applaud. It goes completely silent. You ask yourself, did this man just save the human race, or damn it? Within 12 months, he is in prison. But here's what nobody told you. That's not even close to the most disturbing part of the story. The scientist who went too far. Jiankui wasn't a villain. He was a man who genuinely believed he was about to save millions of lives, and for a brief moment, the science agreed with him. He grew up in rural Hunan province, the kind of place where ambition alone isn't enough to escape. But he was different. He earned his physics degree in China, crossed the Pacific, completed his PhD at Rice University, and landed a postdoctoral fellowship at Stanford, one of the most competitive research environments on the planet. By his early 30s, he had returned to China riding the wave of Beijing's Thousand Talents program, a government initiative designed to pull elite Chinese scientists back from Western institutions and fund their work with no questions asked. He had a lab, a budget, and a mission. What he did with all 3 would change the world and destroy his life. The science he was chasing wasn't science fiction. It was CRISPR, a molecular tool that works like a pair of precision scissors for your DNA. You find the exact sequence you want to cut, you snip it out, and the gene is gone permanently. Scientists had been using it on plants, animals, and isolated cells for years. The results were extraordinary. But there was one line the entire global scientific community agreed on, one boundary, that everyone, everywhere, had silently decided was sacred. You do not use CRISPR on a human embryo that will be implanted and carried to term. Because that edit doesn't just affect the person born from that embryo. It lives in every cell of their body, forever, and gets passed down to their children and their children's children. That line existed for a reason. Jiankui crossed it anyway. His target was a gene called CCR5. Think of CCR5 as a doorway on the surface of your cells, a biological entry point that HIV uses to get inside and destroy your immune system. Disable that doorway, and HIV has no way in. Lock it shut at the embryo stage, and the child born from that embryo would be naturally resistant to one of the most devastating viruses in human history. On paper, it was elegant. On paper, it was genius. He recruited HIV-positive fathers and their healthy partners, told them he could give their children a life free from the shadow of the virus, falsified ethics approval documents, edited the embryos in his Shenzhen lab, and implanted them. And then, he waited. But this was just the beginning of his nightmare. 2 girls were born. He called them Lulu and Nana. And for a few weeks, He Jiankui sat on the most explosive secret in the history of modern biology. He had done it. The world's first genetically edited human beings were alive, breathing, and growing in a city in southern China, and nobody outside his lab knew they existed. Then, he made the decision that ended everything. In November 2018, he walked into the Second International Summit on Human Genome Editing in Hong Kong and told the room what he had done. He expected awe. He may have even expected applause. What he got was silence, followed by one of the fastest and most unanimous condemnations in the history of science. Researchers who had dedicated their careers to pushing the boundaries of genetic medicine stood up and called his work reckless, dangerous, and deeply unethical. Not because the goal was wrong, but because he had taken a permanent, irreversible action on 2 human beings who had no voice in the decision and embedded consequences into the human gene pool that no one could predict or undo. Within 12 months, He Jiankui was arrested. He was tried behind closed doors, convicted of conducting illegal medical practices, and sentenced to 3 years in prison. He served every day of it. But here is the part that keeps scientists up at night. He Jiankui got out. He is free. The punishment is over. Lulu and Nana, however, are still edited. Their DNA is still altered. The CCR5 doorway is still locked, imperfectly, inconsistently, with outcomes no one fully understands yet. And when those two girls grow up and have children of their own, that edit goes with them. The experiment didn't end when he went to prison. It's still running, and the girls carrying it have no idea. And if you think that's where China's biological ambitions stop, you haven't heard anything yet. Lulu, Nana, and the forever edit. Most people heard the headline and moved on. Scientist edits baby genes, gets arrested, goes to jail. It sounded like a cautionary tale with a clean ending, the rogue researcher punished, the world put back in order. But the moment you understand what a germline edit actually is, you realize the story didn't end. It just went underground. Every medical procedure ever performed on a human being, every surgery, every drug, every therapy, has one thing in common. It affects the person receiving it. That's it. You get a hip replacement, your hip is replaced. You take a medication, your body responds. The change begins and ends with you. What He Jiankui did to Lulu and Nana is categorically, fundamentally different from anything medicine has ever done before. He didn't treat them. He rewrote them at the embryo stage, before a single cell had divided, before a single organ had formed. That means the CCR5 edit isn't in some of their cells, it's in all of them. Every neuron, every blood cell, every reproductive cell. When Lulu and Nana grow up and have children, those children will carry the edit too, and their children after that. He Jiankui didn't just alter two girls. He inserted a permanent, heritable change into the human species without the consent of the girls, without the consent of their future children, and without the approval of a single legitimate scientific or ethical body on Earth. But then came the detail that made the scientific community go completely cold. The edit wasn't even clean. Independent researchers who analyzed the available data found that the CCR5 modification in the twins was inconsistent, what scientists call mosaic, meaning some cells carried the full edit while others did not. In plain terms, Lulu and Nana may not actually be HIV resistant. The entire justification for crossing the most sacred line in modern biology, the whole reason he gave for doing what he did, may not have even worked. The girls aren't protected. They're just different. Permanently, irreversibly, unpredictably different, in ways that no one alive today has the tools to fully map or the timeline to fully observe. And this was just the beginning of what scientists feared. The CCR5 gene doesn't just exist to give HIV a doorway. It plays a role in immune function, neurological development, and the body's response to other viruses. Some research suggests that people who naturally lack CCR5 function are more vulnerable to certain strains of West Nile virus. Others have found correlations with cognitive differences. The scientific community's objection to He's experiment was never about HIV. It was about editing a gene whose full biological role we do not yet understand in a human being who cannot consent, and locking that change into the genetic inheritance of every generation that follows. You don't get a trial run, you don't get a recall, you don't get to undo it when the long-term data comes in 20 years from now. Lulu and Nana are growing up somewhere in China right now. Their identities are protected. Their location is undisclosed. The Chinese government has never provided a formal update on their health or development. The two most scientifically significant human beings alive today are being raised in deliberate anonymity, and the experiment that was done to them, without their knowledge or consent, is ticking forward with every birthday they celebrate. He Jiankui served 3 years and walked out of prison in 2021. He has since re-emerged, posting on social media, talking about returning to research, acting as though the chapter is closed. For him, maybe it is. He paid his legal debt. He did his time. But the payoff of his experiment isn't a prison sentence. It's not a fine. It's not a retraction in a scientific journal. The payoff of what He Jiankui did will only be visible in the bodies of children who don't exist, yet children who will inherit a genetic edit they never agreed to, made by a man they'll never meet, for a problem their parents faced before they were born. The experiment isn't over. It just doesn't have a lab anymore. And while the world was still processing what one scientist did in a Shenzhen basement, China's official science was already doing something far larger, far stranger, and operating in plain sight. China's industrial organ factory. If He Jiankui was the lone wolf, the rogue scientist operating in the shadows, falsifying paperwork, hiding what he was doing until he couldn't anymore, then what you're about to hear is what happens when the Chinese state decides to do the same thing, but officially, openly, and at a scale that makes one edited embryo look like a rounding error. There are 1.2 million people in China right now waiting for a kidney transplant. 1.2 million. To put that in perspective, that's more people than the entire population of Dallas, Texas. All of them waiting for an organ that, statistically, most of them will never receive. The global organ shortage isn't a crisis on the horizon. It's a crisis that has been killing people quietly for decades. And China, with its characteristic refusal to accept a problem it can engineer its way out of, decided to solve it in the most audacious way imaginable by growing human organs inside pigs. You heard that right. Not artificial organs, not lab-grown tissue on a scaffold. Actual, functioning organs, hearts, kidneys, livers, lungs, grown inside the body of a genetically modified pig, harvested and transplanted into a human being. The science behind it is called xenotransplantation, and China hasn't just been researching it, China has been industrializing it. Here's what that actually looks like. Scientists take a pig embryo and perform a series of precise genetic modifications, knocking out the pig genes that would trigger immediate immune rejection in a human body, then inserting human genes that make the organ behave more like something your immune system recognizes as its own. We're not talking about 1 or 2 edits. The transplant performed at Anhui Medical University in May 2024 involved a 10-gene modification, 3 pig genes removed, 7 human genes inserted. The resulting organ wasn't fully pig and wasn't fully human. It was something new, and it worked. But this wasn't even the most significant moment. In March 2024, a gene-edited pig liver was transplanted into a brain-dead patient at a military hospital in Xi'an, not as a permanent solution, but as a proof of concept. The liver functioned for 10 full days with 0 immune rejection. 0. In the history of cross-species transplantation, that result had never been achieved before at that level of stability. 10 days is not a cure, but 10 days is a door swinging open. Then, in October 2025, surgeons in China performed something that would have been considered science fiction a decade ago. The world's first gene-edited pig kidney transplant into a living human patient. Not a brain-dead body used for research. A living person, awake, who needed a kidney and received one from an animal. The surgery was announced by state media with the kind of calm, procedural tone usually reserved for infrastructure projects. No ethical hand-wringing, no public debate, just a result. And that tone is the most revealing thing about all of it. The West has been attempting xenotransplantation research too. American surgeons have performed pig kidney and pig heart transplants in small numbers. But every procedure comes wrapped in layers of ethical review, public disclosure, regulatory scrutiny, and institutional caution. Progress moves in inches. In China, it is moving in miles because the regulatory appetite for risk is simply different. And the state's willingness to fund and accelerate biological solutions to human problems operates on a timeline that no Western institution can match. Here is the question you are left sitting with. If a pig kidney keeps a human being alive for 20 years with no complications, does the origin matter? If a modified pig liver saves a child who would otherwise die on a waiting list, is the ethics committee's hesitation worth that child's life? China isn't asking those questions out loud. It's answering them in operating rooms. And if you think growing organs inside animals is the most disruptive thing Chinese biology is doing right now, wait until you hear what they did to diabetes. Insulin-free in 75 days. For over 100 years, the medical world has operated on a single, unchallenged assumption about diabetes, that it cannot be cured, it can be managed, it can be monitored, it can be slowed. But the idea that a diabetic patient, someone whose body has lost the ability to produce its own insulin, could one day walk away from their medication entirely and never look back, that was not a treatment goal. That was not even a research target. It was considered, in the plainest terms, biologically impossible. Then, a 25-year-old woman walked into Tianjin First Central Hospital in China, and 75 days later, she stopped taking insulin completely. She had been diagnosed with type 1 diabetes, the version where your own immune system turns against you, systematically destroying the pancreatic cells responsible for producing insulin. She hadn't made a meaningful amount of her own insulin in years. Her blood glucose was in the healthy range only 43% of the time. She was dependent on daily injections, constant monitoring, and a medical routine that controlled her life. Then researchers took a sample of her own fat cells, chemically reprogrammed them into stem cells in a laboratory, and coaxed those stem cells into becoming islet cells, the exact cells her immune system had spent years destroying. They injected those cells back into her body, and then they waited. 75 days. That's all it took. Her body began producing its own insulin. Her blood glucose stabilized. The injections stopped. 1 full year later, she still hadn't taken a single insulin shot. Her blood glucose was in the healthy range 96.2% of the time, up from 43% before the procedure. The research team at Nankai University, which collaborated on the trial, published the results in the journal Cell. The scientific community acknowledged it. And then, in the West, it was almost immediately buried under the noise of the next news cycle. But this was just the beginning of what the data showed. Type 2 diabetes patients, the far more common form, affecting hundreds of millions of people worldwide, achieved similar results in 11 weeks. 11 weeks from injection to insulin independence. Not reduced dependency, not lower dosage, complete independence. The kind of outcome that no drug trial in the history of diabetes research had ever produced, because no drug trial was ever designed to produce it. Drugs don't cure, drugs maintain. And a patient who is maintained is a patient who keeps paying. Now do the math. The global diabetes drug market is worth over $1 trillion annually. Insulin alone generates $26 billion every single year, a number that only grows as diabetes rates climb globally. The companies that manufacture insulin have spent decades refining their formulas, extending their patents, and ensuring that the drug remains slightly better, but never unnecessary. A diabetic patient cured is a diabetic patient lost permanently. And the pharmaceutical business model was not built to absorb that kind of loss at scale. This is not a conspiracy. It doesn't need to be. You don't need a boardroom of executives deciding to suppress a cure. You just need a system where the financial incentive to manage a disease is infinitely larger than the financial incentive to end it, and where the institutions funding research, approving treatments, and setting the regulatory timeline are the same institutions that profit from the status quo. The cure doesn't get suppressed. It just doesn't get prioritized. It doesn't get fast-tracked. It doesn't get the kind of billion-dollar investment that a new long-acting insulin formula gets. It sits in a journal, it generates a press release, and then the world moves on. China moved differently. The trial wasn't funded by a pharmaceutical company with a revenue stream to protect. It was funded by a state that measures success in solved problems, not sustained profits. And that difference, that single structural difference in who controls the money and what they need the outcome to be, may be the reason a 25-year-old woman in Tianjin is living insulin-free right now, while hundreds of millions of people elsewhere are still paying monthly for a condition that may already have a cure. And when you line up everything you've just heard, the edited twins, the pig organs, the diabetes cure, one question becomes impossible to ignore. The country rewriting biology. Step back for a moment. Look at everything you've just heard, not as separate stories, but as chapters of the same book. A Stanford-trained scientist uses CRISPR to make 2 baby girls genetically resistant to HIV, gets arrested, serves his time, and walks free, while the girls he edited carry that change in every cell of their bodies for the rest of their lives and into every generation that follows. A state-funded program engineers pigs with 10 genetic modifications to grow human-compatible organs, transplants a gene-edited kidney into a living patient, and announces it with the tone of a infrastructure update. A research team reprograms fat cells into insulin-producing tissue, injects them into a type 1 diabetic, and watches her walk away from 100 years of medical consensus in 75 days. These are not coincidences. They are not accidents. They are not the work of rogue individuals operating outside the system. They are the output of a country that made a deliberate state-level decision that the risk of moving too fast is acceptable and the cost of moving too slow is not. But here's the tension that nobody wants to say out loud. The ethical frameworks that govern biological research in the West were not built to be obstructive. They were built in response to real horrors, experiments performed on people without consent, treatments rushed to market that maimed and killed, a history of science weaponized against the vulnerable. The caution is not bureaucratic cowardice, it is institutional memory. And when you strip that caution away entirely, you don't just move faster. You also lose the thing that protects the people who can't protect themselves, the patients who trust the researchers, the children who can't consent, the future generations who inherit the consequences of decisions made before they existed. He Jiankui understood this, which is exactly why he falsified the ethics paperwork instead of applying honestly. He knew the answer would be no. So he decided his judgment was worth more than the systems. And two little girls are now living proof of what happens when a brilliant man decides the rules don't apply to him. And then came the part that reframes everything. He Jiankui didn't go to prison because China thought he was wrong. He went to prison because he announced what he did before the government was ready for the world to know. The crime wasn't the editing. The crime was the timing. China's official position condemned the experiment publicly, but within years of that condemnation, the same government was funding xenotransplantation programs at military hospitals, publishing stem cell diabetes results in international journals, and transplanting gene-edited pig kidneys into living patients with full state backing. The line he crossed wasn't a moral line. It was a logistical one. He went public too soon, too alone, and without the institutional armor that turns a controversial experiment into a national achievement. That is the most unsettling thing in this entire story. Not the edited girls, not the pig organs, not even the diabetes cure. The most unsettling thing is the realization that the difference between a scientist who goes to prison and a program that gets state funding is not ethics, it is control. It is whether the government decides the experiment serves the national interest and whether the timing is right to let the world find out. China is not waiting for the world's permission to rewrite human biology. It never was. While Western institutions debate, review, consult, and publish guidelines, China is operating in a system where the question is not should we, but how fast can we? And the results, whether you find them thrilling or terrifying, are already here. They are alive in two girls growing up in an undisclosed location. They are functioning in the body of a patient who received a pig kidney. They are visible in the blood work of a woman in Tianjin who hasn't touched an insulin needle in over a year. He Jiankui went to prison for crossing the line first, but the line didn't hold. The question was never whether humanity would rewrite its own biology. The question was always who gets to hold the pen and who gets to decide when the rest of the world is allowed to know. China already answered that question. It answered it in a Shenzhen lab, in a military hospital operating room, and in a stem cell trial that the pharmaceutical industry would very much prefer you had never heard about, but now you have.